Okay, I think that we should get started. We're getting a bit of a late start. I'm very pleased to introduce David Morris from Concordia University. His expertise are in phenomenology, particularly focusing on Merleau-Ponty and Bergson. He's published widely in this area. And I'll just mention his book, his 2004 book, The Sense of Space. And today he's going to give us a paper entitled From the Nature of Meaning to a Phenomenology of Nature.
Thank you. Okay, so a key question that's posed by our conference is whether human experience can be naturalized. That is, conceptualized as integral with nature as we understand it. And a central context for this question is ongoing debates about the relation between mind and nature. It is in this context that I wish to speak today. Now, my studies lead me to think that questions and debates in this area are deeply informed and led off track by an uncritically accepted philosophical and scientific residue and commitment we can trace back to Descartes at least, namely the concept of nature as a moving material system devoid of inherent meaningfulness. Mindful human experience as meaningful is thus at odds with nature. It can't be naturalized. If, on the contrary, we can show that meaning is not just in the head, but is right there and it indeed arises in the very movement of nature, then we can find a way to conceptualize human experience as integral with nature. And my thought is that showing this entails a new ontology of nature, a new way of conceptualizing what nature is, and this isn't, on the other hand, a vitalism. To further contextualize my claim, let me note that the mind-body and mind-nature debates typically take mind as the sole ontological and conceptual difficulty, as if the obvious problem is fitting a very strange thing, mind, into a body and nature that cannot harbor mind. That's another legacy of Descartes. Michael said a lot about things like this in his book. In recent years, though, various researchers have argued that we must rethink our typical, in fact, latently Cartesian concepts of the body. In my terms, this rethinking of the body amounts to the revelation of the body not as a meaningless machine, but as a system whose living dynamics and behavior already exhibit cognitive and meaning-generating characteristics. Some, such as the philosopher Renaud Barbaras, go further, insisting that resolving the mind-body problem similarly entails a new concept and ontology of nature. This is the phenomenologizing nature point. The moves afoot, in effect, expand the field of meaning by noticing how the dynamics of living and natural systems, in fact, already exhibit a kind of meaningfulness that could harbor mind. But this expansion of meaning entails new ways of conceptualizing the body and nature, and that's the move that I want to pursue here. Now, my way of pursuing it hinges on a methodological strategy that stems from phenomenology. Phenomenology, I'm claiming, is a philosophy that is radically empirical, in that it aims to begin with what shows itself in experience, and to have what shows itself educate us into the proper ways to conceptualize things. In keeping with this radical empiricism, my phenomenological strategy is to let nature itself educate us into properly conceiving the way in which meaning is at work in nature and the ontology that makes this possible. But to do this, I first need to show that experience makes available a field of nature, or more precisely of life, that can itself educate us into a new concept in nature. I call this life as transcendental field. In saying that life is a transcendental field within experience that can educate us into a new concept of nature, I'm saying something provocative vis-a-vis phenomenological method. So in section 1, I'm going to trace the methodological issue by way of briefly introducing phenomenology to those not familiar with it. In section 2, I'm going to leap into an empirical critical study of embryogenesis so as to describe life as a transcendental field that itself institutes irreducible meaning. This makes life phenomenologically available within experience as a sort of lens into nature that can give us insight into a new ontology. As an example of this, in the final section, I briefly suggest how immunogenesis can let us glimpse an ontological point about what is behind meaning in nature. I'm giving a condensed report from an ongoing, much bigger project in a way that makes it accessible to a broader audience, so no doubt puzzles, challenges, and worries will remain, but I think I am probably going to be making both parties to this conference upset. So anyways, somebody's got to do it. Section 1. As noted above, phenomenology is a radically empirical philosophy that seeks to get our conceptual frameworks right by seeking a method for letting the phenomena tell it how to think. Don't betray the phenomena, a view that it shares with science. But anyways, I think this contrasts with a method that articulates concepts solely or mostly by analysis or reflection on what we humans have said or thought about things, which, from a phenomenological view, that kind of strategy, that perspective might allow deeply rooted or hidden cognitive prejudices to distort our concepts. Phenomenology, in other words, is a descriptively and empirically driven method for, as Wittgenstein would put it, showing the way out of the fly bottle. But it goes further than methods such as Wittgensteinian linguistic analysis or Kantian critique, since in showing the way out of the bottle, it trusts neither our existing language nor our reflective activity as immediately obvious as the basis for our analyses. It ends up being a sort of eversion of Kantian critique. It seeks concepts manifest beyond our own reflections, such that rigorously describing what shows itself also thereby, in effect, describes a conceptual critique that has already taken place. Let me illustrate by drawing on Husserl. He discovered that the flow of cognitive experience itself manifests what he calls a horizon structure. For example, a table appears as such in virtue of its present aspect, inherently indicating a determinate, yet open-ended horizon of other, as yet indeterminate aspects that are revealable as I move around. My point is that describing this horizon structure as it is itself manifest amounts to a descriptive critique of, for example, classic clear-cut conceptual oppositions between actuality and potentiality. The field of cognitive experience thus offers a critical lens into conceptual and ontological points. In our context, it helps to say that phenomenology thereby challenges what I'll provisionally call our anthropocentric prejudice, a tendency to take what is obvious to us as human beings in our everyday lives, doing and building things, etc., taking that as a model for grasping things in their own terms. Husserl's horizons provide an example. Actuality and potentiality are easy to conceptualize on the model of a storehouse of possibilities, where actuality takes out and activates a possibility already determinately there in the storehouse. But Husserl shows that horizontal phenomena themselves challenge our human storehouse model. Likely he dubs this phenomenological structure a horizon precisely because horizons out there in the world, like the horizon of the Earth, are kind of strange. They challenge our deep anthropocentric prejudice to grasp phenomena as stuff, solid, all there, and so on. Now, science also identifies and challenges our anthropocentric prejudices. For example, it makes a great deal of sense to us to conceptualize things as having and reflecting essential and fixed identities. But Darwin famously shows that such thinking is challenged by living things and muddles our conception of them. Indeed, the life sciences typically conceptualize living systems in terms of the latest human technology, but then find that these systems themselves challenge such conception. Yet, science typically solves such conceptual problems by discarding one human model for another. Let me be clear, such models let science do productive, predictive work. But in the end, even a predictive model could very well betray the phenomena. To rule out this betrayal of phenomena, we would need a rigorous, principled way to show that natural phenomena themselves fit our concepts, that our concepts are not merely anthropocentric projections. With this observation, we move from the work of science to the worries of philosophy, or the worries of science when it becomes philosophical. Methodologically, we would beg such worries if we tried to resolve them through anthropocentric means or perspectives. This is precisely where phenomenology comes in as rigorously seeking to let phenomena lead us to our conception of them. It tries to cut short our worry about being stuck in a merely anthropocentric position, which is precisely the skeptical worry that meaningful experience is cut off from nature. It does that by leaping out of that worry altogether. And it does this by an empirical demonstration that, in fact, what is given in experience is already something more than just our anthropocentric position merely. That's part of the intentionality issue. In other words, phenomenology is radically empirical to the extent of saying it is an empirical question whether we are in fact stuck in an anthropocentric view split from nature. And by the way, the very idea of an anthropocentric view precisely buys into a human manufactured anthropocentric concept of self-enclosed views, a view of what human beings are, and so on, all of which need phenomenological critique. In slightly more technical terms, we would seem to run into a methodological difficulty deploying phenomenology to address our problem about experience and nature. That's because phenomenology precisely aims to start from what we call experience. So it would seem that any of its conceptual results about nature would be merely subjective, as they spring from our experience. My claim, though, is that this view gets both phenomenology and experience wrong. In fact, it precisely begs the question of what experience is. It presumes that experience is just in the head. Indeed, I would argue that Husserl understands that we must be radically empirical in letting thinking and experience themselves empirically show us what they are. And in doing so, he discovers that thinking is not really a Cartesian I think that could be detached from the body and nature, but in fact inherently involves a bodily kinesthetic I can. Bit by bit, living movements beyond us are thereby revealed as integral to experience. Husserl himself thus suggests a way in which living and natural movements beyond the anthropocentric are integral to the experiential field, such that they could give us an educating lens into a new concept of nature itself. And that's the phenomenology strategy I want to pursue. I'm not claiming that Husserl is quite doing that, or at all doing that. I have to confess that this strategy leaves some thorny scholarly and methodological difficulties. Some of these prolong the above worry that phenomenology cannot rightly integrate nature into experience, and some prolong the skeptical worry that phenomenology can never get beyond subjective experience. You can see that these methodological worries in fact coincide with our very question about the relation of experience and nature. I also have to confess that in writing this paper, I beat my head over these worries all summer long, how to address them for this sort of audience, and how to address those in their own right. And the response really boils down to insisting, as I did above, that the answers to these worries are empirical. The worries start with unempirical presumptions about the cogency of skepticism as a philosophical position, and what experience, nature, and phenomenology are. It's an empirical question whether phenomenology is possible, and whether experience makes nature available as a field of phenomenological study. The phenomenologist insists that her conceptual results are empirically descriptive. What will convince you that she's got the concepts that truly lead us out of the fly bottle is the way things themselves are, not an argument fully contained within herself. The skeptic will respond that we can't get anywhere through mere descriptions. That's all too naive. But in saying that, the skeptic presumes that we have to run our claims through our own autonomous critique and reflection, that these sorts of internal reflections are the only source of rigorous critique. But that presumption is the very thing that leads to, invites, and demands skepticism. In a word, phenomenology begins with a radically empirical critique of what I shall call the skeptical complex of our philosophical tradition. We start from this complex that says doubt everything, and sort of can't ever get beyond the residues of that, I think. This is why, for example, phenomenology must begin with what Merleau-Ponty calls the primacy of perception or perceptual faith, and later interrogation as a sort of hyper-reflection that begins from reflection's installation in being. He starts from that versus the claimed autonomy of classical reflection and critique that presume that it operates from a starting point outside of what it's talking about. Now, the skeptical complex is symmetrical, interchangeable with the very experience-nature divide that is our concern. Getting out of it, I contend, entails an empirical demonstration that experience already manifests resources for a critique of that divide. Namely, it manifests life as a transcendental, irreducible field of meaning that manifests a lens into an ontology that undoes the experience-nature divide. So that's my methodological section. Section 2. Now that demonstration first requires a phenomenological description of meaning. As a first step, I urge us to describe meaning through the term sense. Here I'm drawing on Merleau-Ponty, who discovers that human meaning is at root a bodily phenomenon. Meaning thus emerges from the way it fits into and is oriented by a situation beyond and prior to what is meant. That issue nicely resonates in the French word for meaning, sens, which also connotes direction and sensation. It also lurks in the English word sense, as when we speak of mirror images having different senses, or things not making sense when we can't fit them together. The shift from meaning to sense helps us challenge our anthropocentric prejudice of thinking meaning is in the head, since sense emerges in a fit with something beyond the head. The skeptical worry is that this fit with something beyond is merely our projection, in which case experience and nature remain divided. Now, fits between things entail differences between them, but not all differences manifest fit or sense. Descriptively, sense involves something showing itself as this, not that, such that the difference between this and that is itself at issue in and makes a difference to and in that very showing. Let's consider a familiar case in human life. Grasping the sense of love entails encountering it as emphatically not being hate, etc. And moreover, encountering the difference between love and hate and so on as salient, as making a difference in that very encounter. Someone who's prepubescently oriented to erotic behavior, but who does not yet grasp that or how such behavior makes a difference, is salient to the erotic as such, doesn't yet quite grasp the erotic. Sense, I'm saying, we can formulate it as saying sense entails differences that make a difference. Requires more work, but that's a formula. On this description, we can detect sense in a broader field of life. For example, in bacteria, the difference between the distant presence of glucose versus something else makes a difference to the swimming behavior of the bacterium. And moreover, this is a difference, the detection of which the bacterium itself works to maintain. It's thus a difference that makes a difference to a bacterium. If you don't find that difference making a difference, you have a dead bacterium. Distant gold doesn't make a difference to the bacterium, and to that extent we can say that glucose is meaningful to the bacterium, but gold isn't. And that point echoes in Francisco Varela's An Active Approach to Cognition, which grants bacteria a kind of cognition of a sort in such behavior. But I want to turn to embryos. I'm going to do that through biologist Eric Davidson's remarkable 2006 book, The Regulatory Genome, which shows in just totally astounding detail how animal embryogenesis can be explained in terms of the regulatory genome. The central problem for Davidson and embryology is explaining how one totipotent cell develops into a highly differentiated and species-typical body and can do so in face of perturbations. Development to type, despite perturbations, is said to be regulatory. Davidson focuses on the genome as the enabler of regulatory development, hence his concept of the regulatory genome. His central claim is that the regulatory genome amounts to a computer composed of hardwired genetic elements. The genomic computer's complex information processing capacity is what explains development. Information processing then determines where, say, a leg versus an antenna is to grow. It's because this processing is inherently flexible in responding to changing inputs that development can be regulatory. Now, in my terms, such information processing would in fact generate sense. Proper positioning of organs within the organism's layout is crucial to the viability and thence salience of the organs and the organism. That this organ is to be a leg, not an antenna, and that the leg is to go here, not there, is a difference that makes a difference in and to the living organism. Sense thus appears in embryos, but the skeptic is going to urge that sense is not really there in nature itself, it's just our projection of meaning into nature. Science would typically endorse that claim because it can show how differences are produced by, say, information processing, without granting that these are differences that make a difference for or to something other than our consciousness observing organism. The issue is this: can the production of differences be reduced to informational processes that can thereby be abstracted from any fit, orientation, or embeddedness in nature and living systems? Can it be abstracted to informational formulae or algorithms? Or do we need to describe and conceptualize sense as inseparably generated right there in living natural movement itself? Let's go back to Davidson. He argues that each regulatory DNA sequence of the regulatory genome, and here I'm going to quote a little bit, amounts essentially to a hardwired biological computational device. The regulatory genome is a vast, delocalized computer, and its operation can be symbolized as in a computer program by a series of conditional logic statements. And he really does this. It's astounding. Okay, end of the quotes then. Now, while Davidson acknowledges differences between the regulatory genome and a digital computer, he nonetheless conceptualizes it as executing an information processing task that can be analyzed and operates as a series of modular information processing subtasks. This implies that generated differences are conceptually reducible to an abstractable, idealized algorithm. So, embryogenesis doesn't involve what I'm calling sense and differences that make a difference. Is this right? Well, not even Davidson is so simple in the matter, and what my phenomenological strategy demands is looking at how the regulatory genome actually manifests itself and operates. This will show, I contend, that the genome's modular operation as an information processor in fact depends upon a complex embeddedness in its environment. That environment is, first of all, the internal milieu of the growing body, which in turn is embedded in and open to a broader environmental surround. I argue that the bodily environment of the regulatory genome, in fact, plays a key role in orchestrating development. The operation of the regulatory genome as information processor and the growth of the body are reciprocal and ontologically internal to one another. In effect, I'm arguing for something like embedded, expanded, and enactive cognition, roughly speaking, on a micro scale, where it's not cognitive but developmental discriminations that are at issue. And because of this embeddedness, we find sense, not just information, at issue. We need some technical precision to make this claim and its conceptual implications regarding meaning clear and compelling, and I'm afraid I have to be all too terse here. In terms of Davidson, my claim is that the regulatory genome ought not be conceptualized as a classic computer, a finite state automaton. That's an anthropocentric strategy. Instead, the operation of the regulatory genome involves something much stranger and harder to think about, namely the organism as what I call a finite state structure, or better, a self-articulating structure. This structure encompasses both the regulatory genome and the growing body in its broader environment as ontologically internal to one another. And here I'm drawing on Merleau-Ponty's early concept of structure, for example, his description of the soap bubble as shaping itself through its overall dynamic in its environment, such that we cannot separate a formula or idea of the bubble's shape from the bubble's existence, or vice versa. In other words, what's responsible for the bubble's shape, which we might want to conceptualize as a function, for example, in information processing terms, is inseparably embedded in the very dynamics of the bubble. The developing organism is like this bubble structure, but the regulatory genome gives the organism as structure a dynamic and recursively complex articulacy and responsiveness that the bubble lacks. That's what I call its self-articulating character, which enables regulatory development. Without the regulatory genome, the organism would not have this self-articulacy. But crucially, it's not the genome on its own as information processor that does the articulating. What does that is the organism with its genome. To support and deepen this point, let me note that the regulatory genome does not specify an already fully fixed overall growth process, as if development merely reads out steps of a fixed plan. The frog egg, for example, doesn't grow directly into a frog. It first grows into a tadpole that only then can grow into a frog. The tadpole body is thus ingredient in whatever we might want to call the frog plan. It's not the genome itself that pulls off the trick of being a frog plan. To have a frog plan that can actually make a frog requires the genome operating in a tadpole body, because it's only as spread out and rhythmed in a growing tadpole body that the genome and its bits and pieces are able to produce a frog. The regulatory genome is not building and assembling parts according to a plan in a human manner, but complexly modulating the dynamics of the growing body. Development operates recursively by modulating prior bodily stages to develop new plans. It's more like London building on an intricate past than Brasilia rolling out by a master plan over an empty plain. The operation of the regulatory genome is thus always internally related to its body. Again, while we can rightly construe the regulatory genome as exhibiting informational processing characteristics analogous to those of our machines, that does not mean the regulatory genome as it is itself manifest operates as a mere information processor or program for differences. This is an abstraction conduced by our anthropocentric models, and here I think Evelyn Fox-Keller is on my side, but I'll leave that out. To put it another way, the regulatory genome works by recursively responding to genetic signals in ways that modulate these signals, but also modulate the very way the genome responds to these signals. To that degree, the regulatory genome approximates to a classic finite state automaton, which has computational power precisely in recursively switching itself from state to state based on inputs, where each state itself has different responses to inputs. Now, classic finite state automata depend for their operation on their program and fixed mechanics, which classically involve a clock or other coordination system to orchestrate and sequence computations. But given the regulatory genome's internal relation to the body, the genomic computer not only grows, as Davidson might admit, what orchestrates its computation is the very body whose development it is regulating. We can't really conceptualize the regulatory genome as an information processor that merely as such generates developmental differences. The regulatory genome's processing is as much regulated and orchestrated by the body that it regulates as the genome regulates that body. To demonstrate another way, any program that runs on a classic Turing machine can be specified in abstraction and run on any other Turing machine at any rate you want it to. But you can't do that with the regulatory genome. As cloning shows, you can't simply take the genome from one organism and stick it in just any other organism, expecting it to be viable. You have to stick it in the right sort of organism and in an organism in the right state, right dynamic state, and also at the right temperature. That's a rate issue. In other words, the regulatory genome's operation is open to and embedded in further dynamics beyond it. Indeed, we find that cellular dynamics and states can be epigenetically inherited and modulate development. It's this embeddedness in something beyond, in bodies and environments, that I think warrants my claim that embryogenesis manifests sense, something more than differences produced by an abstractable or idealizable information processing system. We find differences that make a difference to and in the organism, insofar as the generation of these differences is inseparable from the very body and environment in which these differences arise, and where these differences are salient to the organism's viability. And all of these differences are being generated, I would say, instituted on a level far below that of bodily movement or perception. They're instituted on a kind of pre-perceptual kinesthetic level in which the organism is pre-effectively feeling itself out in a way that will eventually enable it to feel the world. Now, just to recap, to end this section, the move I'm challenging would say that the ordered production of developmental differences can be boiled down to an abstract informational process that can be analyzed without reference to anything like a point of view or anything meaningful. The differences are meaningful to us, but not in themselves. Against this, my effort was to return to the phenomena themselves as revealed by science, and have the phenomena challenge the anthropocentric conceptual models, in this case computational, that enable the above claim. And that's a strategy that Merleau-Ponty in one place calls bringing science to auto-critique, letting scientifically revealed phenomena themselves describe a conceptual critique of the frameworks that science is operating with. This allows me to argue that what is manifest in human experience as what I called sense is also rightly described as being manifest in life more generally. I could put this point in terms of expression in Merleau-Ponty, but I'm going to leave that out. Now, this is what lets me speak of life as a transcendental, what I'm calling a transcendental field of sense. Now, full account of this term and justification would take more room than I have, but here's the basic thought. In the Cartesian Meditations, Husserl engages us in a transcendental reduction that suspends all already given or presupposed claims as to meaning, but he shows that in the midst of the suspension, in what he calls my pure living, cognitive experience appears as having a self-evidently meaningful determinacy, which institutes an irreducible and thus transcendental field of sense, which, as sensible, gives us a platform for justifying philosophical claims. And my big flashlight moment reading Cartesian Meditations teaching one time is, that's just this here stuff taken up in a different attitude. So the transcendental field of sense here isn't something spooky, far off in a Platonic domain or something. It's just here understood as irreducible in a certain way relative to our attitude. And my point is that once we have scientific access to nature, we find that life, in fact, also institutes a transcendental field of sense, but beyond ourselves merely. There's some deeper points here, but strategically and methodologically the point's important because at this juncture we find nature itself showing itself as a platform for making claims about it. It's got a sense that's going to orient our claim making. And that means there's a sense of meaning beyond human experience as anthropocentric, and that can give us a non-anthropocentric lens into such meaning and its genesis. Okay, that's the end of part 2. So part 3, this goes even further. But philosophy remains tangled in the hall of mirrors and shadow boxing inaugurated by its skeptical complex. Mightn't all of the above remain our own projection? It might show the way in which we can grasp sense as in nature, but how's it really there in nature? We find it easy to grasp that there is sense in us because sense is so self-evident in self-reflection. That's precisely what Descartes reveals in the Cogito. Further, the Cogito reveals sense as appearing within our own activity. So if we have to say how it is that sense appears, to give an account of the ontology of sense, we easily say it's constituted by our activity. That doesn't go quite all the way in accounting for sense, but it's at least cogent and compelling. And indeed, Kant's account of the ontology of sense precisely hinges on not going any further than that. Yet, recent work about the body and Merleau-Ponty precisely says, we don't wholly or wholly actively constitute sense. We're passive to the body, life, and so on in our own experience of sense. And above, I argued that there is sense in nature. So once again, how is there sense in nature and the body beyond our own experience? Now here I think we're running into an ontological problem. For underneath all the above, I think, is an issue about what philosophers call negation and the negative. Negation is manifest in the cogito's activity. Recall Descartes' argument that grasping the ever-changing wax entails an idea that entirely surpasses any positively given presentation or imaginary image of wax. Only such an idea could let us comprehend wax as such, so as to be able to judge this here thing is wax, not something else. Similarly, Socrates urges that grasping two sticks as equal entails a look or idea of a quality that surpasses any positive givens we look at. Ideas are not given positively, they are negative. Now, sense, as we've described it, entails negation. Love is not hate. But it looks like negation would have to involve a sort of activity that precisely surpasses givens. Sartre's the most vociferous advocate of this position. He argues that the origin of negation and thence meaning is our nothingness, is freeing us from any sort of positivity. So here we run into an ontological problem. How can there be a negative within positively given material nature? Drawing on some things in Merleau-Ponty, I'm conceptualizing this as the problem of the negative in being. My position troubles the skeptic precisely because it claims that negation arises in nature. It's tainted by life. Indeed, the thought that negation is tainted by life is precisely what prompts skeptical worries that our cognitive activity might be muddied and mistaken, taken in by a world to which it is passive, where the consciousness might die. In response to the skeptical complex, I'm going to double down on phenomenological empiricism. I'm going to let life itself educate us out of this ontological worry and problem by showing us how there can be a negative in being, albeit it's ontologically peculiar vis-a-vis our anthropocentric concepts. To do this, I'm briefly going to turn to the acquired immune system. There too we find sense being generated, and in a most remarkable way, precisely because we mammals can acquire immunity to pathogens never previously encountered. How does this work? The usual answer amounts to a selectional shuffling of ontologically positive terms. Basically, the immune system hinges on protein receptors that latch onto antigens in the manner of locks fitting to keys. But, amazingly, the very process of generating receptors randomly reshuffles the locks, and the body destroys the locks that would latch onto self and cause us to destroy ourselves. The typical result is locks that are keyed only to pathogens. Now, scientists and philosophers like Irun Cohen and Henri Atlan have challenged this essentially informational processing model, arguing that meaning is actually at stake in the immune process, and further and more important for me, Cohen contests the anthropocentric lock and key model as insufficient to the phenomena. He does that by focusing on the chemistry of protein receptors, which reveals that receptors are quite dynamic systems that would never univocally lock onto just one key, sort of like if you made locks out of jello or something like that, vibrating jello. They're sloppy. In biochemical lingo, they're degenerate. Now, to explain how degenerate receptors nonetheless discriminately identify pathogens, which is what they do, he shows how immune identification arises when a bunch of receptors come together in a complex, such that the receptors respond to one another's degenerate and sloppy responses in a process that Cohen calls co-respondence. In this process, we find a determinate difference or negation arising, but it's the case that that negation is not reducible to some already fully given positive locks. Negation arises as a sort of surpassing of positive givens from within their own complex dynamic. In my view, this process opens insight into the negative in being. Now, what interests me here is the way that this hinges on what we call degenerate receptors. For Cohen, this degeneracy is positively given. It's there in the receptor itself. But that, I think, is an all too anthropocentric view and concept. When we say receptors are degenerate, we're saying, hey, they fit with more than just the one antigen that we'd expect them to or want them to fit. But imagine a receptor that we chemists see can fit A, B, or C. Like it can do that because of its dynamics. Yet, in its cellular environment, it only ever encounters B. It doesn't then actually operationally exhibit what we would call degeneracy. Now that whole thing, this is part of a bigger thing, but it leads me to realize that degeneracy is a phenomenon manifest relative to and enabled by what the bounds of the cell and body let in. So here I'm sort of realizing how negativity in this immune system has to do with boundaries and so on. There would be no degeneracy or immunological sense if everything always interacted with everything else at once or simultaneously. Now, in my view, the immune system thus leads, and this takes more work, but it yields an insight into what's ontologically at stake in the negative in being. The insight is that if sense is ever to sneak into being, if there's ever to be a negative inside being, being, so to speak, has to leave room for ruptures, boundaries, spacings, and distances between things, for a non-connection or incongruence, such that place and location matter. It has to be the case that being isn't there all at once. This is a hard thing to think about, because here we're starting to get into ontological concepts that are precisely hard because they challenge our deepest anthropocentric prejudices and the deepest commitments of the skeptical complex, namely the need to find some least possible unit of analysis that's already given all at once and with absolute certainty in some sort of system where the relation of all parts can be simultaneously given, because that's the only thing that would get us out of the complex. Instead, I think nature is showing us, it's getting us to think that being isn't given as already all connected, but rather operates as it does through a sort of need to work itself out, to connect itself up. For being to be, it sort of has to connect itself. This point that I'm making, which emphasizes a distribution that ruptures a would-be all-given simultaneity, mirrors a point about time made by philosophers like Bergson and scientists like Ilya Prigogine in his work on dynamic systems. Just as they're arguing time is real and makes a difference to being as successive, I'm saying that a sort of distribution that ruptures being is real and makes a difference to being as simultaneous. All this leads me to the difficult thought that if there is a sense in being, this is because being is a sort of non-coincidence, such that being is never identical or equal with itself. It always surpasses itself, but from within, not because of some already given external ideal. This would almost say, being is sense. It's oriented by its own being as dislocation. Sort of overlaps against itself. Earlier I said that the skeptical complex precisely worries that its point of view, which is the locus of cognitive activity, might be dislocated from itself, embedded in a body or nature that would disrupt it, and thereby erupt into doubt. And here I'm led to the thought that perhaps the fundamental movement or gesture of being just is a sort of non-unitary dislocation that challenges any effort to find anything, let alone a point of view, that is what it is in and of itself in some purely localized or unitary fashion. Being is itself embedded in something further, but that something further is its own dislocation. Being is distribution, disruption. Put in terms closer to contemporary science, I might be able to say here, or try to say here, that being is uncertainty itself. It's not positively given, but neither is it a purely negative ideal that could be grasped as pure information. Rather, as uncertainty, it doesn't coincide with itself in its givenness. And here I'm converging with Prigogine's thought that time is real. And as uncertainty, being itself would be the standard in virtue of which information, understood in information theoretic terms as a determinate distribution of probability actualizations, it itself would be the standard by which information becomes information. Information would thus not be abstract but immanent in being. Being as uncertainty would thus be sense. And I guess I just have to say that I know these thoughts are hard to follow. They're speculative. But, you know, there's a point where Merleau-Ponty says the philosopher goes all the way, which is to say, you know, you take something and you follow it its implications. That's what I've been trying to do. And I've been doing that because I think it might help us grasp how meaning is an institution older than human experience, such that experience and nature are not at odds. Thank you.
Very good. So, plenty of time for questions. We'll just start with you and just keep your hands up for a second.
So me?
Yeah. You.
You sort of set up your view to be an argument against what you saw as being a species of anthropocentric.
Against, sorry?
Against a sort of anthropomorphizing view of isn't, I mean, if you're going to read sense, which is a sort of semantic notion, into the sort of stuff that goes on in dynamical systems, I mean, that seems like a perfectly good story of the biological emergence and development of what, at our level, we call intentionality or something. But to read it actually into the bottom level biological stuff, surely that's the most anthropocentric.
Right. And that's the criticism that various people have articulated against Thompson and so on. And what I'm trying to do is make as compelling a case as I can from within, an attempt to take the scientific results, which are completely remarkable and so on their own terms, and to say, hey, look, I think those, like if you try and see how it really works and what's really being talked about, there are ways in which the usual conceptual frameworks betray what's actually going on, simplify it too much. That's of course necessary to do the work. We got to do the work, but then there comes the time to figure out what's going on in these things themselves. And the move I'm trying to make is saying, look, it's not merely an anthropocentric position, because the phenomena themselves, to grasp what's really going on, demands of you certain conceptual moves. Okay, the move to sense, right? And that's at stake in some of the discussions around self-organization, right? Like, again, sometimes in science people want to say, well, I'm just using these terms like self, etc., as a heuristic, but I can get rid of it. And I'm trying to argue against the claim that these things could be merely heuristic on the evidence of the things themselves. My argument might not work, but that's the strategy. And I really do have to say that, look, behind this is the thought that nature is quite remarkable. It accomplishes things in ways that human beings would never think of accomplishing things. We just build things in a totally different way. And to really follow what's going on in nature requires a sort of disassembly of our usual apparatus, and that's a very hard thing to do. And I think we have to go further in that effort. And I see a constant pulsion in science, in the history of science, of the way that sort of presumptions that are snuck into our conceptions end up being challenged by the very strange ways in which natural systems achieve their operations. So that's what's behind it. Whether you're convinced or not, well.
So I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what you said, but I want to try and get a little bit clearer about the actual conditions under which you think we're compelled to think of the world as it were, doing its own sense making. Because it seems there are different things going on at different times, and I couldn't quite pin it down. So let's just pick on one sort of straight. So when you were talking about the regulatory genome activity, it seems to be an argument with something like this, that there might be a way of understanding that in sort of computational terms. There's a commitment about computational explanation, which is to suggest that the computational part of that can be abstracted away from its context and specified in a way that the context doesn't determine. And so then the thought is, but in these cases, the context in which the putatively information processing bit is working is doing as much of the determination of the outcome as the enemy. But then that's a condition. That sounds too weak, or at least I want to throw a case at you where it looks like you might be compelled to say that, but it looks like one might not want to. So, I mean, this is a case that I think comes out from Phenomenology's work, where he says, look, the length of our legs, right, is partly determined by some stuff going on internally. But it's partly determined by the force of gravity, right? If we had exactly the same internal stuff, but we were transported to another planet where the force of gravity was very different, we'd have different length legs. So in that case, it looks like the context is doing some of the determinative work. And would you say that's another case of kind of sense making on those grounds? Or
no,
is there something missing? So the question is, what's missing in that case?
First of all, that wouldn't really be sense making unless the legs got to the wrong length and wouldn't. I mean, the issue of length is whether the legs are going to operate as legs. Right. If my legs got too long and spindly, they break. So there is an issue of sense making there, but it's sort of not as important as where the legs are positioned, and that it's a leg and not an antenna or another arm, or something like that. But just coming back to the first part of the question, I think my point was this. Look, I was sort of structuring this as a dialogue with a kind of skeptic that I might expect to find at the conference. And sort of with the move that's saying, hey, look, Morris, you're claiming there's sense there, but all it is the result of computation. And we can think of computation in robust scientific ways in informational terms that can be abstracted from living systems and that don't depend upon us thinking that they arise within this dynamic of life itself, right? And so the thrust of the argument, just to clarify, was to say, no, actually, the way that living organisms happen to make sense is inherently embedded within this context and inseparable from it. So it's not like we want to say the sense boils down to the informational processing thing because we're good at analyzing things at this way in this time, and that's a remarkable discovery that we've made. We can take this approach, right? But I want to say, like, what's really at issue here is a system that makes sense, that happens to have evolved in such a way that it leverages information, what we call informational processing characteristics of DNA. That's the way it happened to sort out in evolution on our planet. And yes, it's right to do all that stuff for scientific purposes, and it's illuminating and necessary for understanding what's going on. But let's not make the mistake of saying, oh, the real place where sense is coming is from the informational processing capacity which we can conceptualize as a computer. The real place is organisms working themselves out as overall systems within environments. Right? So the generator of sense, I was using the locution as the organism with its genome. Right? So that's the move. And if there is sense being made in the organism with its genome, and we can't really rightly boil that down to just information processing, then that's going to sort of say, hey, look, take seriously that there's something interesting going on here in terms of differentiations and so on. That's the strategy.
Yeah, go ahead.
So now, again, I'm getting clearer now, but can I just check that last claim? So is the claim that in order to see the information, the part of the computer thing of as information processing, as the information processing system it is, we have to recognise the contribution of the context? Or is it that the language of information processing is misleading, part of perhaps a consequence of the kind of sceptical nature of you called it, and that really we should ditch that kind of language? Because two different claims.
Both those things,
okay.
Actually, right? So, and I think they're connected. Because the language is misleading, in application to this system,
right,
or application to the system as a whole rather than an abstraction of it, then we're sort of missing the way in which the informational processing language isn't sufficient to really describe what's going on in its functions. Okay? So it's both those things interacting.
Thank you. My question is, it's more historical one. You make a lot of this idea of there being a skeptical complex in philosophy, but it seems to me that historically it's various forms of realism which have dominated. Although there are leading skeptics from Pyrrho, the optimist, Descartes, Hume, these do seem to be more as minority figures. And even those who, like, for instance, Locke, for instance, want to place limits on human knowledge, that's not the same as they're denying it, they're skeptical. So it seems historically this skeptical anxiety it just doesn't seem to be there.
Nice question, and let me just explain that I provisionally labeled Descartes the bad guy again, as I always do for purposes in my classes. The origin of the skeptical complex is it's easy, and then I correct it later on. The origin of what I'm calling the skeptical complex is really with Descartes, because I don't think you have quite that configuration beforehand. And the point of the skeptical complex isn't to say people remain skeptical. It's that their answers, their claims about what really is the case get shaped by a need to respond to skepticism and a need to a kind of account that presumes the subject-object divide as something to which we need to be accountable. And I think there's a presumption there about that. That's why I say that Descartes is initiator, because there's a plausible way of talking about Aristotle, the medievals, and so on, as not operating with the subject-object divide. That gets really nicely laid out as a serious and important question with Descartes. Right? So it's like the skeptical complex is the worry that what I really need to be addressing is these foundational questions and so on about how I ever get to say anything in the first place. It doesn't stop you from making claims. It's just your claims get shaped by the escape from the skeptical complex. And I think I see that all the time.
You didn't get me at all?
Oh, I didn't see you.
Oh, sorry, I was first.
Oh, you were first. Are you sure?
I saw it.
I saw it.
I saw it.
You saw him put his hand first. Okay, well, let's him go. Who's first?
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sure you're righteous. No, it just struck me that what you're doing is very much the kind of total opposite of the naturalizing of phenomenology. It's more to try to show that the concept of sense in phenomenology has a place also in what most people take to be realms that could be sorted out by causal analysis only. So it's a kind of opposite move. Then the question, of course, becomes what do you mean by sense? Because if you take the examples of bacteria reacting to sugar, embryological development, or the immune system, it seems to me that in none of the cases, of course, we have full-blown intentionality in the terms of content. But it also seems to me that, at least in the terms in the cases of the bacteria, and also the first 12 weeks maybe of the embryo, and in the case of the immune system, there's also know what it's like to be an
Sure.
embryo or a bacteria. So in that sense, I mean, if we put it in terms of selfhood, it's certainly not reflective selfhood, and it's also not pre-reflective selfhood. It's not even a kind of feeling. You termed it pre-effectively feeling itself out of the embryo. I mean, pre-effectively feeling.
Well, you can
It's
see that there was a
self-feeling.
problem there, right?
Yeah. So the question is, of course, how if this concept of sense is really broader or something else than what Varela, for instance, talked about as autopoiesis.
I mean, probably. I'm trying to deal with things like dynamic tendencies and self-organizing, and trying to figure out how to handle that. And I guess part of it is sort of the thought that I think there's a strong argument that consciousness needs to be bodily. It needs to be able to. It's temporal, and it's needing to act in its environment. So there's sort of like I think there can be a sort of constraint point about embodiment, and embodiment needs a certain type of nature. If the universal constants were slightly different in our universe, I think you can make an argument that there wouldn't be the sort of differentiated materiality that we find that would allow for things to organize in certain ways, and allow for bodies, and allow for consciousness as a phenomenon. And I guess I'm not giving you a good. First of all, we have to talk about different kinds of sense that are more implicit, more explicit. But I guess the thought is, if you're going to take the embodiment claim seriously, and meaning as embodied seriously, then there has to be some way in which you start sorting out how those two things come together. And sense as a sort of oriented movement in a very liminal way, I think is part of a way of starting to develop an ontology of sense or something like that.
Okay, I'm afraid that we've run out of time, so I'm sorry for the people that have questions. Maybe you can ask at the drinks. So let's thank David for a very interesting paper.